Hello Revolution students. This video is a guide on answering or how to answer the end of year Revolutions exam. I'm going to take you through the do's and don'ts of what to do so that you can get the marks that you want at the end of the year. So anyway, sit back and enjoy. So the first thing, have a look here, and we have got the front page of our exam. And this is, I'm using as a guide last year's exam, the 2019 exam. And the first thing you should look at is you have two sections here. You have section A and you have section B. Section A you must answer on one revolution, and section B you answer on the second revolution that you have studied this year in your course. So for example, we have studied the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. So we could, for example, answer section A on the Russian Revolution, and if we chose to do that, then we would have to answer section B on the Chinese Revolution. If we flipped it and decided to answer section A on China, then we'd have to answer section B on Russia. You cannot just do all of the questions on the Russian Revolution or just all of the questions on the Chinese Revolution. You must answer questions on both. The second thing you'll notice is that the marks for section A and the marks for section B are exactly the same. Both sections are worth 40 marks, which means you have to allocate the same amount of time to each, the same amount of effort. If we look up here at the time given, you have 15 minutes for reading time and then 2 hours for writing time, which means that you're going to spend 1 hour writing on section A and 1 hour writing on section B. And then you've got, as I just said, the 15 minutes reading time. And with this 15 minutes reading time, you use this 15 minutes. You don't just look out the window and go, oh, that's nice, or meditate or whatever. You use this 15 minutes to read through the examination paper and identify what section you're going to do. So we get to page 3 here, and you can see there are 4 sections of 4 parts of the exam just in section A. One for the American Revolution, one for the French Revolution, one for the Russian Revolution, and one for the Chinese Revolution. Now, you did not study either the American or the French Revolution, so you ignore those. But you did study the Russian and the Chinese. So, for argument's sake, you've sort of decided, well, I want to do section A on Russia. So then that means I will go straight down to page 12 here. I won't even bother with looking at the American and French Revolutions. I don't have time. So I go to page 12. So I'm going to zip through, zip, 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 and I get to page 12 here. And here is the start of the section on the Russian Revolution. If I go back a page, well, there's nothing there. If I go back, these questions here are actually about the French Revolution on page 10, so I ignore those. I'm only doing the Russian Revolution in section A here. And section A, this is section A part 1, and they are questions about Russia AOS 1, Area of Study 1. So 1896 to October 1917. And this is the big, as we know, the big focus of Russia AOS 1, the same as China AOS 1. What were the factors that led to the revolution? What were the causes? And in section A, part 1, you are going to have a source analysis. Okay? And the source analysis questions, here's source 1 here, it's a written extract. Source 2 is an image, and then there is a source 3, which is a written extract as well. And then there are the 3 questions which you have to answer in relation to these sources. Now we go back to the previous page, we see source 1 here, written extract. There is no hard and fast rule for this. There could be 3 sources, there could be 2 sources in this section. The sources could be just written extracts like this, or they could just be images, or a combination of one or more of these, okay? So it just depends. The key when you are analysing a source such as this, you must quote from the source in your answers. You must put quotes from this source or this source here, source 3, in your answers down the bottom here. And for source 2, you must refer to specific features of the image. And this image here is about 1905, 9th of January 1905, so that's Bloody Sunday, even though it doesn't actually refer to it there. This title, 1905, is a historical interpretation produced in 1930. It shows events in St. Petersburg on the 9th of January 1905. Even though it doesn't say specifically Bloody Sunday, we know from our study that this is what this image is referring to. And you can see all of the protesters having been shot by the police when Tsar Nicholas wasn't even in St. Petersburg at the time. But anyway, so anything in here, these are features. The source information down here is actually a feature as well. And just keep in mind that the dates here, all right, so it represents the events in 1905, but it was actually created in 1930 by Mikhail Avalov. And it's nice that that's been referred to up there. Sometimes in exam papers it's not, sometimes it is, so you just have to keep an eye on that. So anyway, here are our features that we have to respond to. Sorry, our sources that we have to respond to for these questions, and then we'll look down at these questions here. So you've got, and the structure of these questions will be the same on future exams, on the exam that you're going to do in November this year. So you're going to have, it's question 1, A, B, C. And the general rule is for A and B, you write a minimum of 125 words, and then for C, you write 250 words minimum, which gives you a total of 500 words for this part of the exam. This is quarter of the exam, so this is 500 words, and you should devote, because it's a quarter of the exam, you should devote half an hour to it. And if you break it down even further, the C question down here is half of this entire worth of marks or whatever. So you would devote 15 minutes to this, and then as closely as possible anyway, 7.5 minutes for question A, and then 7.5 minutes for question B. Question A here. The question's asking, using sources 1 and 2 and your own knowledge, outline the grievances that caused Russian workers to protest in 1905. Well, we've already spoken about Bloody Sunday. We know this image here refers to that. If we go to the previous page and the extract, what does it say? Extract from petition prepared for presentation to Nicholas II, January 9th, 1905. It's probably petition prepared, and it's Father Gapon. Yes, there you go. Father Gapon's petition. We've looked at this in class, and this is a part of it. So the question A is asking you to refer to source 1 here as well as source 2 here. Sometimes you might be able to have one statement that refers to both sources. I think in this case it'll be a little bit more difficult, because that is the petition is very separate from what actually happened at Bloody Sunday itself. So you would have to refer to separately to source 1 by quoting from this document here, and then source 2, a specific feature here. And when you are looking at a feature, there's so much as in images that you can write about. You try to identify the key feature, okay? And you might, I mean, that just jumps out, doesn't it? 1905, bloody, so the massacre, and then of the protesters, and then you could maybe link that into the bodies down here, one or the other, and then you got the police. And the question's asking, outline the grievances that caused Russian workers to protest in 1905. So you would have to include a quote from here, a feature from here in your response, and then you would include at least 1 point of your own knowledge. So it might be something more you know about the petition. It might be a statistic about the number of the estimated number of protesters who died or were wounded in this event. That's up to you. But what you need to do is you need to make sure that you both refer to the sources and include your own knowledge. There have been questions in the past where they just refer to, the question asks you just to discuss the sources, but they're not very common. It's mostly, more often than not, you have to talk about the sources and use your own knowledge. So there's a lot there for you to write about. So ideally, 2 to 3 points. And make sure that you include your own knowledge. And that your own knowledge, you have a point which includes, as I said before, a statistic. It could include another quote, another part of Father Gapon's petition, which isn't referred to in the extract in source 1 here. That's up to you. Or something else. There has to be evidence from your own knowledge. Question B here is a similar sort of question, but it's only asking you to refer to source 3, so that's all you have to do. Take a quote from source 3 here, and then use your own knowledge. Explain the grievances that caused peasants to revolt in 1904, 1905, 1906. Okay? And we're all about the land seizures and so forth. Okay, so there's a lot there. There's lots of different things you could write about. This is a bit easier, so you just have, once again, 125 words. And you would quote at least once from this source here. And include your own knowledge. Something from your own knowledge might be about the Russo-Japanese War, might be about the peasant mortgages, something like that. But as long as you answer this question, you refer to the source here with a quote, and you include your own knowledge, 1 or 2 pieces, then you should get good marks. The final question here, question number C. Question C, evaluate why workers' protests and peasants' uprisings failed to overthrow the government of Tsar Nicholas II by 1916. Use evidence to support your response. So, this question, as we stated before, you should be writing a minimum of 250 words. About 15 minutes you've got to write this. And you need to pull out the key terms for this question. So it's asking you to discuss workers' protests, peasant uprisings, so 2 things here, and then how it failed to overthrow the government of Tsar Nicholas II by 1916. Okay, so the other key, obviously, the government of Tsar Nicholas II, so he's being overthrown. We know he gets overthrown in February 1917. Early March, he abdicates in early March 1917. But the question's only asking you by 1916, okay? Workers' protests and peasant uprisings failed to overthrow the government by 1916. So that can go up to December 1916, okay? The end of the year, all right? And you have the option in question C here of referring to these sources 1, 2, or 3, but you do not have to. It's no longer necessary. You should have a contention at the start of your response here. Evaluate why workers' protests and peasant uprisings failed to overthrow. So workers' protests and peasant uprisings failed to overthrow the government of Tsar Nicholas II by 1916 because, for example, the army was still loyal to the regime. Something like that. Or something else, but that would be your contention, and then you would have 4 points. Now those 4 points could refer to these, but they no longer have to. You don't have to, but they must include 2 historical interpretations and 4 points in total. So your historical interpretations can be included in your 4 points. 1 point you would have about workers' protests, maybe another point about peasant uprisings, and something else, whatever you want to talk about. So these are the questions for Section A, Part 1. We will now move on to Section A, Part 2. So this is a quarter of the exam. Then you would answer these 2 questions here. So you would answer these two questions here. And these two questions, this is probably the most difficult part of the exam, okay? Because this part of the exam is on Russia Area of Study 2, so from October 1917 to 1927, and it's asking you to discuss and talk about or show your knowledge of the sort of regime that was created, sort of government that was created, political system and so forth that was created once the revolutionaries got into power, whether they created the sort of society that they aimed to create, and if they didn't, what were the challenges that they faced which stopped them or limited them from creating the society they wanted to, and finally, did the actual people benefit from the new government of the revolutionaries, okay, the revolutionary government. Now the difficulty about this section, this part of the exam, section A, part 2 of the exam, is that these two questions here could be on any of the topics listed under Area of Study 2 for Russia in the study design. So some of these topics in the Russia Area of Study 2 are quite obscure. National minorities and so forth, whatever. They can be aristocrats, etc. So they can be quite obscure. The Cheka is always a popular one. So it can be any, and so it's difficult because you don't have any sources to work off, and it's all about showing your own knowledge of the particular topic that's being asked. Now last year in 2019, the two questions were, question number 2, explain how the Bolshevik government was able to defeat major political opposition from October 1917 to March 1921, sorry. And there's a specific period of time here, which is a clue. And then question, and that's quite open-ended, that question. This one is a lot more specific. Explain how the new economic policy changed political and economic conditions. Use evidence to support your response. Use evidence to support your response. So you have, for this section, another half hour to answer these two questions, which means that you have 15 minutes on question number 2, 15 minutes on question number 3. Each question should start with a contention and then have 4 points. So you would have, for question number 2, a contention about how the Bolshevik government was able to defeat major political opposition during that period, and then you would have 4 points, and then for question 3 your response would be a similar structure. You start with the contention and then 4 points. You do not have to, in these questions, include historical interpretations, but it's a good idea to, because it shows knowledge, your knowledge, shows your knowledge once again to the examiners, and it cannot hurt. So, and for each of these questions you would write a minimum of 250 words. So 250 words minimum for question 2 and 250 words minimum for question 3. Many of you will have no problems writing 250 words. If not, and many of you will get to 300 words or more on these responses. So there. This question here, October 1917 to March 1921. So major political opposition. There's a lot going on here, isn't there? So you could talk about political parties, such as the SRs and the former the white generals and so forth. You can talk about the Civil War. It's going up to March 1921, so pretty much the start of. It's covering those economic policies of state capitalism and war communism, and then war communism is replaced in March 1921 with the NEP. So really, you're focusing on that period up to the end of war communism and Kronstadt as well. That's when Kronstadt comes in, doesn't it? March 1921, and the workers' opposition, which you could talk about in this question too. This one, explain how the new economic policy changed political and economic conditions. This is very focused. It doesn't give you the dates, but you know that the new economic policy was introduced in March 1921, and then it goes right through to 1927. Lots of things you can talk about here. You talk about the reintroduction of markets and so forth, the semi-capitalist nature of the economic policy. You could talk about the scissors crisis as well. You would have to include economic stats about how it contributed to an increase in industrial production. And we always want those specific stats, such as coal production increasing, steel production, and the stats for those. Okay, so these two sections, that is half of the exam. So that's what you would do if you were deciding to do section A on Russia. However, you might have read those questions and thought, well, hold on, I know nothing or very little about the new economic policy, or I don't feel confident about that. Or you might look at the China part questions in section A and go, well, they're actually easier for me, so I think I'll do China in section A. So let's just have a look and see what we've got. But once again, though, if you've answered these questions, then you would go straight into section B, all right, because you've completed section A. But if you're not going to answer the questions in section A on the Russian Revolution, then you must answer the questions in section A on the Chinese Revolution. So going over, and what we have here is, we'll just zip through this very quickly. Once again, we've got one source there, and yes, so a similar setup to the Russian questions. China here, you've got an image plus 2 written extracts, and the focus is only labour leads to production, a new life movement wall poster. It's all Kuomintang. So yes, so this is last year was very much fun. New life movement, one of the more obscure topics in China AOS 1, but there is a lot of information about that, so the new life movement here. So you might think, well, I don't know a lot about the new life movement, but there's so much information here that I'll probably be able to answer these questions down here. Let's have a look. What have we got? Question A, using sources 1 and 2 in your own knowledge, outline the values promoted by the new life movement. Well, they're there, okay, and then you'd have to that's about working hard, labouring to increase production, and then here's some of those virtues that were promoted during the new life movement by Zhang Jishu and the Kuomintang. So there's no issues really using the sources to answer that question. You might find your own knowledge. What could you include about your own knowledge? Perhaps from your own knowledge about this question about the new life movement. Well, the whole reason why Zhang Jishu promoted it, started it, in order to have a viable alternative to what the communists, the CCP, were promoting amongst the population. So I mean that's one way anyway. That's one thing, one way to tackle this. Question number A. Question B. So using source 3 in your own knowledge, explain why the New Life movement was launched in Jiangxi province. There's some more clues here. And then C, evaluate the extent to which the nationalists' New Life movement contributed to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. Use evidence to support your response. Well, you might use these sources in this, or you probably would, but that's actually quite a difficult question in the sense that you need to use a lot of your own knowledge too. So if I was answering this exam last year, I probably would have avoided doing section A on China, depending on how the other questions were. But let's have a look. We'll turn over to part 2 of section A. And the 2 questions were: explain the extent to which the everyday lives of women improved in the People's Republic of China. That one's quite easy. Marriage law, the constitution, lots of stuff to write on that. Question 3, explain how the first 5-year plan and collectivization were used by the Chinese Communist Party to consolidate the revolution. And this one isn't too difficult either. This one's quite interesting because there's 2 things here: first 5-year plan and collectivization. I mean, you could also talk about collectivization during the Great Leap Forward here. So these are quite simple questions. I think these ones are more challenging, and seeing these, particularly this for question C, I probably would have skipped section A, China. I would have done section A on Russia and then gone to section B and done China, depending on what the questions are in section B. So anyway, let's go forwards. There's that. Now we get to section B here, and once again we've got our index, and it tells us where the sections are. So once again, I ignore America, I ignore France because I didn't do them. Now, I've decided, as I just said before, that I was going to do section A on Russia, which means I am now forced to do section B on China. I cannot do section B on Russia now because I've already answered the Russian questions in section A. So I have to do go to China, page 26, and answer those questions in section B. So we'll do that now. Let's go page 26. I zip up, and there we are, page 26. So firstly, the way section B is broken down, you have the essay or the short essay, which is question 1 here, and then you have another lot of source analyses, which you can see there. This time there are only 2 sources in section B part 2, 2 sources, source 1, source 2, and then the 3 questions again, the same structure, exactly the same structure that occurs in section A. So the essay here, it is worth 20 marks, so it is worth a quarter of your overall marks. It is worth half of the marks for section B, and for section, and because it's worth 20 marks and it's half of section B, you would devote half an hour to answering this question here. So this essay question, and it is, think of it as a short essay. You're aiming for a minimum of 500 words. Many of you will have no problems writing 500 words. You'll easily write, maybe 600 words when you're gunning it. So the word limit won't be a problem. One mistake some students make is that they devote more time to the essay than other sections of the exam because they think, well, it's an essay, so it must be more important. It is not more important than the other sections of the exam. It is worth 20 marks, just as these source analyses questions down here, these 3 questions in total are worth 20 marks. So you devote as much time to this essay here as you do to these questions here. So you devote half an hour. Now the essay question, oh, this is a beauty, this is a wonderful one. The Long March and the safe arrival at Yan'an were responsible for the success of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. To what extent do you agree with this view? That is a very good question. A lot of students last year saw this and were very excited by it. So it's not a challenging question at all. There can be more difficult ones. You talk about the Long March. There's so much to talk about that. And then you can say, well, all right, you can have a couple of points about the Long March and how it was responsible for the success of the CCP, and then you might have some other points about other key factors, such as Maoism or Yan'an itself, what was happening at Yan'an. Okay, some of the policies that were implemented, land redistribution prior to and after the Long March. There's lots of things you can talk about here. Your essay structure, you're going to have an introduction, 3 or 4 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. You have in your introduction, ideally, you must have a very clear contention, a point of view, addressing the key terms in this essay question. And then ideally, you're also going to have a summary of the topics you're going to talk about in the body of your essay. When you're discussing factors, events, and so forth in the body of the essay, you discuss them in chronological order where possible. And you might you may be discussing mostly events, or you might be talking about some key documents or whatever. Regardless, when the key document was written or when a policy was implemented or whatever, try to keep to that chronological order. In the essay as well, you must include historical interpretations, ideally as well as your own evidence. Evidence is a key, and key dates and so forth. So quotes, statistics, etc. Your historical interpretations, you want a minimum of 2. Ideally, they're contrasting. If you can include more, then that is great. Pepper them through the essay, as we say. Then you will excite the examiners and you'll get those higher marks that you are seeking. So that's the essay, 20 marks. Then once you've written the essay, you go on to the second part of section B. And this is about, what have we got here? All right, let's have a look. May 1956, extract. Is this 100 flowers? Is it? It is too. So, let 100 flowers of many kinds blossom. All right, so source 1 is about, I'm not going to read through all of it. Source 1 is about the 100 Flowers campaign. Now, I just want to draw your attention to the source details here. So this is from his speech, Lu Tingyi. Let 100 flowers of many kinds blossom, diverse schools of thought, etc. Speech in 1956. However, it appears in this work, Modern History Source Book 1998. All right. Do not get confused here. Do not think that he made this speech in 1998. He did not. He made it in 1956. So just be aware, sometimes you will be given, if you're given a source, such as a book, you'll be given the publication date of that book. Make sure you don't confuse that when the actual source was created, or the speech was given, or a document written, or so forth. All right. So this speech was made in May 1956. So that's source 1. Source 2. May I invite the intellectuals to express? So this is, once again, this is about the 100 Flowers campaign. And this is also interesting because, and sometimes you will be given this, sometimes you won't. If we go back to the previous source, the source here, it uses the old Wei Giles transcription of Chinese into English. So Mao Zedong, they put the brackets Mao Zedong, the pinyin here. Lu Tingyi, that is also Wei Giles, okay? So if you go over the page and we look here, Lu Dingyi is the same person as Lu Tingyi, exactly the same. It's just that that's how you write his name in pinyin. That's how you write his name in the older Wei Giles style. Lu Dingyi is actually a more accurate rendering of his name if you're going to pronounce it in Mandarin. So most of the time, these indicators will be put in place. They'll put the pinyin and they'll put the Wei Giles in brackets, or vice versa, or whatever. Not all the time. Sometimes there'll be a name that you may not have come across before in Mandarin, but there should be context within the source to guess who this person is, okay? For example, another one, Sun Yat-sen, Sun Yat-sen. His name is also written sometimes as Sun Jong-san, I think it is. So, but just don't panic. Read through the source, it will give you context. Okay, and then once again, the same structure of questions. This time, because we've only got written extracts, you would only be quoting from these extracts. Question A, using source 1 in your own knowledge, outline the reasons for the 100 Flowers campaign. So you'd have to go back to source 1, 1 or 2 quotes from here, and then include your own knowledge about why the 100 Flowers campaign was started by Mao Zedong. And then, and that's not too difficult, using source 2 in your own knowledge, explain how Chinese intellectuals and others participated in the 100 Flowers campaign. So this time you only have to refer to source 2, which is great, and then include your own knowledge once again. Question C. When responding to question A and question B, you can include historical interpretations as your own knowledge if you wish, but you don't need to. Okay, you don't need to. Question C. Analyze the consequences of the 100 Flowers campaign. Use evidence to support your response. So what happened as a result of the 100 Flowers campaign? And there's a lot here. You can talk about what happened to intellectuals in Chinese society. Then obviously you would link it into the Great Leap Forward and all the failures that occurred there and the 3 bad years and the 30 million people dying and so forth. So there's a lot you can talk about here. I remind you, you're going to be writing 250 words minimum for question C and responding to question C. And you must include historical interpretations in here, in this part here. Okay, for question C. You must do it in question C. The old rule was that if you didn't include historical interpretations, then the maximum you could pretty much get was 80%. You'd hit like a glass ceiling. So in order to push through that glass ceiling, you need to include your historical interpretations. Okay, so this is section B. And the one thing I forgot to tell you about in your essay, because it's an essay about area of study 1, you want to, along with referring to including all your evidence, your quotes and your stats and so forth, might refer to some Mao's concepts, whatever, and historical interpretations. You should also include references to long, short-term causes, immediate causes of the revolution. Okay. In this case, you'd probably only be talking about long and short-term causes of the revolution, the Chinese 1949 revolution. Okay, but make sure you're referring to those long and short-term causes, and just indicating, saying that the Long March was a long-term or a long-term cause of the 1949 revolution, or a short-term. So that's section B answered. Now, if you chose to do section A on China, then you couldn't do section B on China because you'd already done it in section A, which means you would have to do section B on Russia. So let's just have a look and see what the questions were like for Russia in section B of the 2019 exam. So let's go back. I know here it is here. And these questions here, once again, you do an essay, and that's about area study 1, Russia. And then the second part of section B, part 2 of section B, is a source analysis again, and yes, written sources, just like the China section B questions. Similar structure. So, question number 1. The essay was from 1896. Long-term causes in Tsarist Russia so weakened the government of Nicholas II that it simply collapsed in February 1917. Oh, that's a big question there. So from 1896 to 1917. So it's covering a big period of time, and it's explicitly stating long-term causes in Tsarist Russia. So that's what you have to focus upon. Okay. Now, the period of time, 1896 to 1917, you ideally want to have points that cover this entire period. So if you have, for argument's sake, you've got 3 body paragraphs, a particular topic for each. For your first body paragraph, you might talk about economic, the recession and unemployment that occurred after the great spurt in the 1890s, early 1890s, which sort of led into the 1905 revolution. You might talk about what happened. You might talk about the Russo-Japanese War, the peasant unrest, land seizures, which occurred in 1905 and continued throughout. And then you might get into World War I as well. Another long-term cause, Rasputin, just hanging around, his role in undermining the credibility of the Tsar as a leader. So there's lots of things to talk there. The main thing is, for this sort of question, which is covering a big period of time, you have points that touch upon the whole period, not just 1896, okay, or before 1905. All right. Okay, so that's for Russia, question 1. And then for Russia area study 2, we have to answer questions, or have to do these source analysis questions. So source 1 and source 2. Source 1, the decree on land. So early decrees, okay. Land was confiscated between November 1917 and January 1918. How much better off were the result? So this is all about the decree on land and land redistribution. And then source 2, in the summer of 1918, Bolshevik leaders discovered that their survival depended on the supply of peasant grain. A Bolshevik invasion was unleashed on the village by requisition. So it's grain requisitioning. And talks about the Tambov as well. Okay, Tambov revolt. So these peasant revolts. So you get, yes, so experiences of villages pretty much. Both sources touch on that. Question A, using source 1 in your own knowledge, outline the importance of land redistribution in strengthening support for the new regime. So you'd have to firstly quote from source number 1 here, and then your own knowledge, quite a bit here. Particularly, you could talk about during the Civil War and this promise of the peasants retaining their land during of keeping their land. Helped the Bolsheviks to retain the support of the majority of the peasants. Okay. During the Civil War, you could talk about that. Question B, using source 2 in your own knowledge, explain how peasant opposition challenged the consolidation of the new regime during 1918 and 1921. So you're talking about, we quote from here, you talk about the Tambov uprising, etc. Okay, and what else you wanted to? So I remind you, for question A, it's 125 words. For question B, it's 125 words. And then question C, analyse the extent to which the revolution improved the everyday lives of peasants. Use evidence to support your response. So this is a very broad question here. And you could talk about what happened under state capital, or the decree on land, state capitalism. Contrast that with what happened under war communism, grain requisitioning and so forth. The Civil War, how that impacted upon peasants' lives. The famine that occurred in 1920, and then you talk about the NEP as well. I remind you in question C, you must include historical interpretations, and you can include historical interpretations about any of those events you wish to. So that is my overview of the exam, my guide to answering the exam. I hope it's been helpful, and good luck.